The conceit of this discussion is that the digital policies that Europe has created are the greatest export since the Beatles. So let me just quickly run through three key things that I hope we can focus on today. The first is that the changes that we have seen in the last 12 months are the slowest pace of change any of us will see in our lifetimes. Now try that one on for size, you know? And when your head hits the pillow tonight, think about that. That yes, we're all caught up in all the changes that are going on. And that those changes are the slowest that we'll see in our lifetimes. That we have moved from a linear expansion of new capabilities to an exponential. And once you get on that exponential curve, it doesn't stop. The second threshold theme today is looking at how corporations deal with that reality. Corporations have a fiduciary duty, a legal duty, first to their shareholders, not to the public interest. And so the question becomes, should those companies be able to make the rules for themselves, or should there be some kind of boundary setting to protect the public interest? We have answered that question in this country thus far in the negative. Both the UK and the EU have answered it in the positive and have tried to develop just what those rules might look like, and we'll talk about that. And lastly is something that I learned 100 years ago from one of my very first bosses, who said to me, "Tom, you need to understand that doing things the way we did them yesterday is just an excuse for not thinking." And that's the challenge that we have in this period of exponential change. Will we think, or will we just continue doing it the way we always did it? Here's another way of saying the same thing that I said before. Change has never been this fast, and it will never be this slow again. That's our challenge. And how do you make policy in that kind of an environment? That's what this whole seminar series is about. We're living right now amidst what I call a digital chain reaction. The first part is how private information, each of our personal information, sets of information that describe us, has been captured using the internet and transformed by some kind of digital alchemy from our personal information into a corporate asset. And that those corporations have then taken that information, hoarded it, and used that hoarding to allow them to control the marketplace and engage in concentration of marketplace activities. You see here the quote from Lena Khan, the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission. "Concentrated control over data has enabled firms to capture markets and erect barriers to entry." So you've got the asset of the 21st century, data. You hoard it and you use it to control markets, enable firms to capture markets and erect barriers to entry. And then what's the result of that? Well, hey, if you control the conduit, you can also control the content. And so if you've got control of the marketplace, you've got control of the information in that marketplace. And we all know that the business model, for instance, of the platform companies is, as they say, enrage to engage. The more people get enraged, excited, the more involved they get, the more time they spend on a site, the more ads that you can sell to, you can show to them, and the more data that you can collect. And bingo, the digital chain reaction is complete and starts again. And this is the model that has been in control for the last couple of decades. This is the model that has built the most valuable companies in the world. And this is the model that enabled artificial intelligence. And so we have a situation today, in this country in particular, where this digital chain reaction has set up a whole new reality in terms of how we interact with each other, how we interact with the marketplace, and created these powerful digital platforms. And then along comes artificial intelligence, which exacerbates the problems that we have yet to deal with for the last couple of decades, and at the same time creates new challenges. And so what's been going on is, in this country, is that for the last couple of decades, we've seen these challenges of the digital platforms coming along, and we've chosen to sweep them under the rug. Congress has failed to deal with privacy, has failed to deal with competitive markets, has failed to deal with online safety, has failed to deal with matters of truth and trust. And we are in this amazing situation where the United States is a leader in technology development and a laggard in technology oversight. I've spent the last 50 years of my professional life. That's kind of a frightening thing just to say right there. I have spent the last 50 years of my professional life involved in new technologies where the United States has both led in the creation and the oversight and built the model for the world. Now, we're existing in an environment where the United States, at least at the congressional level, but this is a typical kind of a comment, where the United States has been ignoring dealing with these issues, opened the door for others to deal with them, and that has invited in our friends in Europe, both the EU and the UK. And the message is, Paulo and I were talking a minute ago about what kind of impetus would get the Congress to finally act. And hopefully it's AI. Because here's the reality that we're facing in an AI world. So we've got these quarter-century-old issues created by the digital platforms that have now have many of the same people using those platforms to deliver AI. And I thought that this quote was particularly salient. Social media was the first contact between AI and humans, and humanity lost. You know, what is social media? Social media is a big database of the information about you and me, manipulated by machine intelligence, early on rudimentary, increasingly more sophisticated machine intelligence, now AI, in order to manipulate us. Yep. First contact of humanity with AI, and we lost. And like I said at the outset, things aren't standing still, they're growing exponentially. Sam Altman, the CEO of and founder of OpenAI, just a couple of months ago, made this observation, that it would only be, quote, a few thousand days until artificial superintelligence came into being. What is artificial superintelligence? Human-like reasoning. A few thousand days. Let's think about the trajectory of AI thus far. AI first came on our screens as consumers in June of 2018, when OpenAI rolled out ChatGPT-1. And the breakthrough was that whereas AI had been the province of a programming priesthood, if you will, where you had to be able to speak a special language in order to communicate with the AI, now it was a chatbot. All you had to do in plain English was type in a question or a statement, and lo and behold, it talked back to you. It was only a few years later, March of 23, that they loaded the bar exam into GPT-4, and it scored in the top 10% of all young lawyers taking the bar. Any of you in a joint program with HLS here? You're lucky. We're now seeing the beginnings of artificial general intelligence with ChatGPT 4.0, where there's actually reasoning going on. Well, should I look at this information to answer the question, or should I look at that information to answer the question? Now, here's the mind-boggling thing. From ChatGPT-1 to today was about 2,000 days. Sam Altman says it's only a few thousand days until we have human-level artificial superintelligence. We can't continue to sweep things under the rug. We can't continue to sit on our policy hands. And in Europe, they're not. I wrote a book a while back called From Gutenberg to Google, which talked about various technology revolutions throughout history, starting with Gutenberg. And I don't know how many of you have picked up this new tome by Yuval Harari, Nexus. Sam shaking his head. It's really good. And I'm sitting there one day reading it, and I'm only in the introduction. and I come across this line. History isn't the study of the past, it's the study of change. And I go, wow, yes, that's what I've been trying to write about. That's what I believe, that how we deal with change is how we write our history. And let's go back to where we all started today. We're dealing with change at an exponential rate. In dealing with change, you've got to think your way through, okay, how am I going to do it? And one of the conclusions that I reached in the Gutenberg book was that it's not the primary technology that is transformational, but its secondary impacts. Gutenberg was about, the effect of Gutenberg was the distribution of, sorry again. The technology was about the distribution of knowledge. The effect was the creation of scientific method, the Reformation, feeding the Renaissance. AI is not just, the significance is not just the technology of AI, but its effects. Last week, Nobel Prize in chemistry won by for the use of AI in tracking what proteins do in our body. The building blocks, the technology that allowed us to understand the building blocks of humanity. And this, I think, is what is important about how Europe has chosen to deal with the digital policy issues. They're focusing on the effects. So the question becomes, how will we respond? Well, we did it before. In the industrial age, mechanical power replaced physical power and redefined life, culture, commerce, replacing an agrarian and artisanal society with an industrial society, and creating, this is the most important part, creating never before seen changes. And after wrestling with those changes for a couple of decades, a few decades, the American people came up with never before seen solutions. And that's the challenge that we're facing today. Where in the intelligence age, where we're using computing power to replace cognitive power, are we going to be as creative as we respond to never before seen challenges as our predecessors did in the industrial era? And the thing we're going to be talking about henceforth is, at least in Europe, they're trying, as opposed to what we're seeing in this country. Now, you probably didn't expect to hear a plumbing lecture when you came today. But this is the challenge that we're facing. I took this picture last year at a very upscale hotel. Now, look at these. This is the sink in the bathroom. If I want to wash my hands, I have a choice between scalding myself under this one or freezing under this one. Why? Well, it turns out if you go back and you look at the etymology of this, about 100 when indoor plumbing first became common, hot water came from a cistern in the attic that had a habit of getting full of dead bugs and feces. And you didn't exactly want to turn on the spigot and have that fill your glass when you're having a drink. So this is when you need hot, this is when you need safe. That was the reality 100 years ago, not when I took this picture. Plumbing has changed, but we still hang on to old ideas. The plumbing of our networks changed, and these folks didn't catch it, and these folks did. Now the question becomes, why are we continuing to act as though this is the reality rather than digital platforms in the age of intelligence? How has technology changed the oversight needs that the economy requires? When you stop and think about it, you look at the industrial barons of the industrial age, and what's happened today, what the digital barons have, these folks could only have dreamed of. That you almost expense-free interact with billions of people so that you can strip mine their data, so that you can manipulate that data to manipulate them. All of this is almost incrementally cost-free, allows you to hoard the data and then charge for monopoly rents to use the data. That's the new world that we're living in. That's the world that is different from the old plumbing. And so our challenge becomes, how do we think beyond the old models? Now, when the Congress of the United States went in the late 19th and early 20th century to try and develop a set of rules and guidelines and guardrails for the effects of industrial activity, look around and say, my goodness, how do we structure this new governmental concept? Because we've never had anything like this in government before. And they looked and they saw, well, here's the management model that is being used by the companies. Let's just clone that and move it over into government. And what was industrial management? It was rigid, rules-based, sclerotic, micromanagement. And so that's what oversight became. We're surprised that we have a rules-based bureaucracy when it comes to regulatory oversight. It was by design, because that's what the entity that we were supposed to, that's what the entity we were supposed to be overseeing was done. And so the result is that we looked like our pet. And let me stop here, because I was saying to Karen before we all started that I would tell a CIA story while I was here. I'm not original enough to think of this, you look like your pet. I was out of the CIA one day, and one of the leaders there said, our problem was that we grew to look like our pet. And when you are When your target is the centralized Soviet structure of the Cold War, hey, all you have to do is be able to penetrate that centralized structure. So you create a central intelligence agency. But the problem is, in the new distributed world, you don't have centralized challenges anymore. And so they had to retool to look like their new pets. I was reading an article about some of the activities preparing for if there is eventual conflict in the Pacific coming up here on the plane today. What are we doing? We're developing a distributed approach rather than a centralized approach, because we have to have the flexibility and the agility to respond to whatever may be thrown at us. So it's time for us, when it comes to regulation, to start looking like our pet again. Because digital companies are managed differently from industrial companies. They're transparent, they're effects-based, they're agile. And how do we create a structure that mimics those, just like we created a structure that mimicked management in the industrial era? The Europeans are trying to get there. The most important word in this sentence is trying. You know, plumbers didn't get it right the first time. Steve Jobs didn't get it right the first time. It's unrealistic to think that regulators get it right the first time. But we've got to be trying to do something. And that's the brilliance of what is going on across the Atlantic. That effort, I submit, is the biggest thing since the Fab Four. Because A, they're doing something, and B, they're focusing on the effects rather than trying to micromanage how a company, a specific company, operates. And what I'm going to assert going forward now is that this is not just pro-consumer. This is not just pro-competition, but this is also pro-companies. The thing that John Sallett and I, when we were at the FCC, used to hear more than anything else is CEOs coming in and saying, "Oh, you can't regulate us because regulation stifles innovation and investment." Well, that's right. Old style regulation has that effect. But we're trying to get away from that sink. And so what the Europeans have said is, okay, innovate away. Just make certain that the result reflects your responsibility to the public interest and show us. Very different from, this is the way you will run your company. Instead, it's saying, here are the expectations that we believe your company should deliver. And here are just some quick examples of how that model is being built abroad. When you look at competition, in the EU, it's the Digital Markets Act, in which they've identified half a dozen what they call gatekeepers, which are entrenched kind of companies. And they have, this is just a quick list of a couple of things that they have in the UK. They have the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, a term that just rolls off your tongue. and they have the similar idea, but they say I'm going to focus on those firms with what's called strategic market status. In other words, firms that have entrenched power, but I'm going to look at them one by one, rather than, as the EU says, a broad group of gatekeepers, and using that great English word bespoke for tailor-made. We're going to have tailor-made expectations for the companies instead of just broader rules. And then when it comes to content, the Digital Services Act in the EU, broad, not just focused on half a dozen gatekeepers, broad coverage with expectations, and same broad coverage for the Online Safety Act in the UK. And again, the interesting thing about this, and I'll particularly focus on the UK at this point in time, is that regulating content is a major challenge if you believe in free expression, right? In this country, we have this thing called the First Amendment. And one of the things that the British have done very gracefully, I think, is to say, we're not going to tell you what to say, but we are going to say, here are the expectations that we have, that you've got a duty of care to make sure that you're not bringing in children who don't have judgment. You've got a responsibility to take down illegal content, that's of course, and you have a responsibility to plan for how you're going to deal with legal but harmful information. And the point here is that these are all principally built on expectations, establishing expectations and managing to them. And you note that I use the word principally, because of course there are some specifics along the way. Gene pointed out to me, and we were discussing this over the weekend, about how there is an expectation in the DMA, for instance, for the sharing of data. But beyond those kinds of specifics, the broad concept is, how do we look at the effects? And here's how the DMA, here's how the EU set out to do that. Well, we're going to have a new goal. We're not talking about what's the effect on consumers. We're talking about what's the effect on the ability of a company, a competitive company, to deliver a choice. We're going to have a new measurement. That measurement is the ability to enter the market, which they call contestability, and non-preferencing, which they call fairness. We're going to have a new target. We've talked about this before, gatekeepers and those with strategic market status. We're going to have a new model where the burden is on the companies to demonstrate that their practices promote that new measurement up in point 2. And we're going to have new expectations that in lieu of regulatory micromanagement, there will be an expectation of self-executing compliance. Here's what we expect. We expect you to self-execute against that. Everything ultimately comes down to pictures. Here is how the traditional market, traditional market oversight worked, something that was made possible because of the fact that we were in a period of linear change rather than today's exponential change, that you would establish regulatory policies. This is what we need, and this is how you're going to behave, because that behaviors that will deliver these marketplace effects. Okay, we'll tell you how to operate in order to achieve these goals. Well, I know, Megan, this is when in the middle of your seminar, the former CTO of the United States walks in. I'm glad she didn't see all the other stuff. No, but it's intimidating. It's great to see it back. So if this is the traditional model, here's the new model. Let me go back and again, what happens in here is, of course, in here, in these, in the stipulation and the enforcement, there are lawsuits, there are judges that have to make decisions, there's implementation issues that get raised, but this is kind of the model. Here's the new model. Then we've got the same public interest expectations, but those are used to inform what we expect out of the companies to drive their self-executing management practices, and then the government can enforce against that. Here's what we think the kind of effects ought to be. Tell us you're doing that, and we can enforce against it. And again, the caveat, of course the lawyers are going to sue. Of course there are going to be implementation challenges. But what is significant is that Europe has begun the step, has taken the first step to head in this direction, while we have been sitting here sweeping things under the rug. I think that this change between those two illustrations is a watershed, but is relatively nuanced. That under industrial oversight, we said, we're going to tell you how to run your business so the public interest goals are achieved. And the new model is, we're going to identify what those public interest goals are, and we're going to expect and enforce that, in fact, they get achieved. And as I said a minute ago, this is just the beginning. Okay, this is step one. I'm not sure this title still works. Even nuances get the blues. I was listening to some bluesy music as I was writing this. But the fact of the matter is that there will be challenges to this, that we've already seen how this great idea of self-execution against this effect invites self-protection. Apple came in, they were supposed to open up their marketplace. Nancy and John did a great session a couple of months ago on how Apple has manipulated what they are arguing is their self-execution against it, thereby forcing the EC, the European Commission, the regulatory oversight body, to challenge that and to specify the kind of changes they need to have, and it'll go to court, and there'll be a final action. And so, again, we're talking about drawing the four corners, stretching the canvas for the four corners. The ultimate image that's going to be painted on it is still a work in progress, but stretching those four corners has been of significant, of earth-shaking significance. Again, the UK, again, broadly similar. And so this, I think, is the key. Okay? Which faucet are you going to be using? Old style regulation, because this is the way we always did faucets and plumbing? Or are we going to reflect new realities that say, hey, you don't have to do it that way anymore. There's a better way. And I think that asking that kind of question is good, not just for consumers, but also for the companies. Here's just a quick run through of some of the things that have happened as a result of the DMA over there. App stores now have open payment systems, you're allowed to have third-party app stores. you're expected to have third-party apps, or allowed is different. Side loading is expected. Meta, amongst Meta's multiple messaging services, they all have to be interoperable. Amazon can't do self-preferencing with third-party data. Google can't do self-preferencing with search information. And the significance here, I think, is that the significance of this to the United States is, one, you don't have to sit on your hands. You can act. And when you act, if you're acting in legislation, here's some models that you might want to consider. If you're acting in litigation, here are some remedies that you might want to consider. Hey, by the way, here's what doesn't work. Thank you very much. We had somebody run a test market. And there is a potential that some of this slops over to us. For instance, when we were talking about the open payment systems, Apple has had to open up their payment systems. PayPal just announced that they're going to be in the App Store. Other payment systems will be there as well, and they used to be shut out, and nobody ever considered, hey, thou shalt open them, until the EU said, hey, you're going to do this. And then Apple, in large part because it's always more expensive to have systems that are developed for this market that are systems that are different from this market, and to have to both have that duplication of expense plus also justify the difference. They open the payment process over here. But I said it's also an opportunity for companies. So one of the things John didn't say when he did that nice introduction is that I spent a lot of my time in the corporate world, as did John. And these are the things that corporate executives hate. They hate uncertainty. They hate regulatory confusion, where one country says this, another country says that, or one state says this, another state says that. They hate markets that are fragmented. One of the beauties, remember we talked a minute ago about how one of the digital realities is that the companies are able to reach billions of people in one swoop. They hate fragmenting that fabulous market, and they worry that rigid regulation thwarts innovation. I think that if we get serious about adopting policies in the United States, rather than sweeping the issues under the rug, we can offer regulatory certainty, that we can offer compatible regulations, that we can talk about a unified market, we can talk about how regulation gets redefined so that it's agile instead of rigid. So the conclusion for the companies is that I think that they are disserved by the current absence of US policies. So, hey, let's sit down. Let's figure out how we're going to make those rules. Quit stonewalling. And I got two stories to tell you in that regard, personal. In the 1980s, I was fortunate enough to be the CEO of the National Cable Television Association. And we were a new technology for which there were no rules. Except for the fact that it comes back to bite you in the tail. Because it meant that anybody could make the rules. And that meant that every city and town in the United States could say, here's how we want cable television to work in our town as opposed to the town down the road. And that destroyed the mass market. That destroyed economies of scale. And so we went to the Congress of the United States and we said, we need to have national policy. We need to have uniformity. And the Congress said, yeah, and Gene Kimmelman, this is when I first met Gene Kimmelman. And the Congress said, well, we need some things from you too. And they came up with some regulatory structures for the industry if we were going to have this kind of certainty. It was hugely controversial within the industry. I was personally sued under RICO. Right? You know what RICO is? It's how you prosecute mobsters. Because I was running a mob-like cabal to pass this legislation.
I didn't do it.
But it passed. That certainty resulted, and what happened? Cable industry took off. I left. A few years later, Gene had to come back in and pass a new piece of legislation to redefine some of that regulation. But the point of the matter is that certainty was a great benefit. Knowing what the rules were was a great benefit to the industry. Jump forward 1993. I'm the CEO of the Wireless Industry Association in the early days of cellular phones. Same problem. You know, it's a funny thing, but the airwaves don't seem to have any respect for the borders between states. And you'd have one state doing this and another state doing that. We went to Congress and we said, we need regulatory certainty. Congress said, hey, we need some things too. So for instance, we agreed to be common carriers. Now, we've had discussions in this seminar series before about net neutrality and how the ISPs don't want to be common carriers. We agreed to be a common carrier in order to get a uniform national plan. It strikes me that this is the opportunity for big tech now. And that we need to have a new reality where we're working on solutions that will benefit everyone with the recognition that no one walks away with the whole pie. But the result is at the back end, consumers and competition are protected and there's stability that allows companies to grow. Now, if you'll allow me, please, one more stretch of my opening point. In 1995, I was a freshman in college. I'm at 65, I'm sorry. Yeah, one of the things I didn't learn in college was how to tell numbers.
Say, Tom, nice try.
Nice try. 1965, I was a freshman in college, and the Beatles came out with this album called Rubber Soul. It was a huge breakthrough. Every other Beatle album, every other pop song had been Boy Meets Girl, Hold My Hand, Saturday Night, you know, these kinds of songs. And Rubber Soul comes out and is a much more complex set of themes. And all of the cuts, all the tracks are interrelated to each other. The following year, America's equivalent, the Beach Boys, responds. And instead of doing their California surfing music, they use new instruments. They use new harmonies. They use more sophisticated kind of arrangements. They unified the sound on a single disc, just like Rubber Soul did. they responded, they learned from, responded, and improved. And what happened in 1967? Bingo, Sergeant Pepper comes out as the Beatles respond to the Beach Boys' response to them. That's the promise that we've got with what's happening in Europe right now. That is why I say that this is the greatest, that regulatory model, the new regulatory model is the greatest export since the Beatles. You know, this was a world in which you shipped vinyl. You know, we would call it a sneaker net today, right? You shipped hard vinyl back and forth. Now we're all interconnected in real time. We've got a chance to learn, and that's why. That what is going on in digital oversight in Europe is the biggest export since the Beatles. It's transformative. It's transformative in that they're doing something instead of talking about something. It's transformative in that they've got a new model that deals with new realities. And it's a first step. It's still to be seen, okay, how's it going to get implemented? Question that we ought to all be asking ourselves is, what's Congress going to do? Are they going to stand idly by and let the rules be defined over there? And the other salient question that will help answer that question about Congress is, are the companies going to quit stonewalling, or are they going to say, no, we need to have rules? We need to have the certainty that comes with those rules. And so our challenge, if we're going to have tech policy for the world as it is, rather than what it was, is will we, who live in a policy world, be as innovating in our thinking as the innovators who created these new challenges? And that's why we ought to now, Claire, listen to some more Hey Jude. But anyway, thank you very much.